Hello, it's me again. My name is Dr. Małgorzata Jedynak, and this time I'll be talking about different approaches to teaching language grammar. And we focus on grammar consciousness raising. I guess that at this time you think, well, we'll be talking about grammar, it's so boring. Well, my main objective is to dispel the myth that teaching grammar has to be boring. So let's start from the question, what is grammar? Let me quote different definitions of grammar. Let's have a look at the most popular one that comes from Penny Eyre. Grammar is the way a language manipulates and combines words or bits of words in order to form longer units of meaning. Or it's a set of rules that govern how units of meaning may be constructed in any language. Or it's the way words are put together to make correct sentences. It's also Penny Eyre. Or according to Cook, grammar refers to computational system that relates sound and meaning. I guess that you remember from your methodology classes different types of grammar, or maybe from your descriptive grammar classes. According to Cook, 1996, there are 5 different types of grammar. The first one is called prescriptive. It's called prescriptive, what the very name suggests. It prescribes what we should say in different situations. And there is also traditional type of grammar. It's called school grammar. That refers to labeling sentences with parts of speech. It gives rules how they are used and combined. Then we have structural type of grammar. That's related to how words go into phrases, then phrases into sentences, and how phrases cannot be put together to make a sentence. Then we have communicative competence that also represents some type of grammar. It's related to ability of a speaker to put phrases together in order to communicate, and knowledge how to use language appropriately. And pragmatic competence, that's related to ability of a speaker to use language for all various public and private functions and communication. Well, you may be actually surprised that in these 5 types of grammar, there are 2 competences. But later on, I'll explain to you why competence may be called. Very important question is, why do we have to learn grammar? Well, nowadays the prevailing approach is communicative approach. So communication is priority. Why do we need grammar? Well, the first argument is proficient language learner knows grammar. So have a look at some typical examples, typical errors that are made by Polish speakers of English. If you like me, you may translate it into czy mnie lubisz? Or how do you call it in English? I guess that's the most popular mistake or error that is made by Polish speakers of English. I guess that you remember that instead of how do you call it in English, you should say, what do you call it in English? So definitely, if we want to think about ourselves as proficient language users, we should use correct grammar. And the second argument is that it's impossible to manage without it, right? Knowing grammar refers to knowing language structure, meaning and use. And finally, the argument that appeared in the previous slides when we've been talking about communicative approach. Fluency is important, that's for sure, but accuracy is equally important. Let's have a look at grammar and how a grammar component was handled in various methods. Well, first, let's focus on GTM, or grammar translation method. I guess that you remember that in this very traditional method, a grammar component was treated in a very conservative way. So it was taught deductively. And exceptions to the rules were presented. Grammar rules had to be memorized. And grammar rules were practiced in translation-based activities. If you think about your Latin classes, I guess that some of you had Latin classes, and about the method that was applied for teaching Latin, definitely it's a typical example of GTM. Then we had direct method. In direct method, I guess that you remember that the lexical component was a little bit more important than grammar, and grammar was taught inductively. If you have problems with this distinction between deductive and inductive grammar teaching, I'll explain to you later on. And then we've got audiolingual method, in which grammar was taught through examples and drills. I guess that you remember the main key words related to audiolingual method. So overlearning, so practicing grammar over and over again by means of different drills. There are different ways of grammar instruction. In the literature, you may find a term, formal instruction. Frequently, it is used to refer just to grammar teaching. But mind you that grammar teaching should not be just theoretical, but also practical. Within different ways of grammar instruction, we have focus on forms, focus on form, implicit versus explicit grammar teaching, and deductive versus inductive instruction. Throughout my presentation, I will be using two abbreviations, FOFS, focus on forms, and FOF, that stands for focus on form. Let's start from focus on forms. It's a very traditional approach to grammar teaching. The methods that are based on this approach are grammar translation method, for instance, or audiolingual method. Course design starts with the parts of language to be taught, such as phonemes, words, collocations, morphemes, sentence patterns, notions, functions, tones, and stress. Let's imagine a situation that an English person wants to study Polish as a foreign language. He or she needs to master conjugations, declensions, all right? In other words, focus on forms is related to memorization, a large number of different endings, right? Morphemes, and so on. Items that are taught are selected and ordered according to such criteria as simplicity, frequency, and utility. If you think about English, most of the time, in focus on forms approach, we start from teaching simple present tense, then present continuous, then present perfect and simple past. Definitely, we do not introduce present perfect tense as the first one. Why? Because for Polish learners of English, it's a tense that is very difficult to master because it's absent in our native language. So we always start with these items that are common to our native language and that we perceived as being quite easy. And learner's job is to synthesize the parts for use. To continue our discussion about focus and forms, I would like to quote Wilkins from 1976, who actually referred to this approach, calling it synthetic approach to syllabus design. To give some examples of synthetic syllabi, we have lexical, that is based on different lexical items. We have structural syllabus, that is based on introducing different structures in the target language. And we also have notional functional syllabus, that is based on notions. To give an example, expressing time in English, or expressing dimension in English, or functional, how to find the way, right? Showing directions. These are examples of a functional syllabus. And this type of syllabus is accompanied by synthetic methods. So we may find it in GTM, ALM, silent way, noisy method, or TPR method. These synthetic devices and practices that are used are the following: explicit grammar rules. So we explain the rules to our students explicitly. We explain the rules, such as present perfect tense is used for expressing the action that happened in the past and had some impact on what is going on at present. Repetition of modals, memorization. If you think about your process of learning Latin, I guess that most of you had to just memorize different endings. Explicit negative feedback or error correction. So in focus and forms, we expect from the teacher to say explicitly, no, that's the wrong form. You need to correct yourself. Most of the time, the teacher provides the student with the right form. And finally, transformational exercises. If you think about exercises such as change a sentence from passive into active or from active into passive voice, well, this is a typical exercise, transformational exercise. What might be the possible problems with focus and forms? Well, I guess that most of you, when you are listening to me, you think, well, we don't like focus on forms. It's so boring. It's so traditional. It reminds me of GTM method and my experience with learning Latin. Definitely, there are lots of points of criticism. One of them is that it's one-fits-all approach. All right? So we just take for granted that all the students have the same needs, the same expectations, and the same learning styles and preferences. But definitely it's not true. And we should make teaching process more individual. So some of you, maybe you like transformational exercises, changing passive voice into active and vice versa, but definitely it does not appeal to me. Another problematic point is that it leads to language usage, but not realistic models of language use. So, can you imagine a situation that you were taught by means of focus on forms approach? And what happens? You know grammar perfectly well. But the question is, do you know how to use this grammar in real life situations? Definitely not. And that's why focus on forms approach was criticized. Linguistic grading of material in focus on forms ignores learning process. Research that is available shows that we learn language accidentally and not like syllabuses tend to imply. To explain to you, if you have a look at a syllabus, which is in focus and forms approach, we may see that they always start from introduction of what? Simple present tense, then present continuous tense, present perfect, simple past. But once again, would you say that for all of you, present perfect is equally difficult? No, it's individual. Actually, learning process is individual. And it depends on you whether you find present perfect more difficult than present continuous or vice versa. And then, despite the best efforts even of skilled teachers and textbooks, focus and forms classes are boring, resulting declines in motivation and attention. Well, I support this point of view definitely. The classes that are based on focus and forms might be boring. Of course, much depends on the teacher, but definitely, if you focus on transformational exercises all the time, after some time you may actually notice decrease in your motivation. The learners in focus and focus approach are not creative. There is no room that is left for your independence, for your being autonomous. Focus and forms produces many more false beginners than finishers, and that's a very, very good point. I know lots of students who actually were exposed to English for 2 or 3 years, and they were learning English by means of focus and forms approach, and they mastered the whole grammar. They know passive voice, all the conditionals, but once again, when it comes to communication, they have problems with real life communication in real-life situations. That's why we call them false beginners. They may complete without any problems any grammar test, but you might have an impression that they actually learn all the time and they never finish. So after discussing focus on forms, let's focus on form. There are so many focuses today. Focus on form is a kind of alternative to focus on forms, but it's somewhere in between focus on forms and focus on meaning. So we may say that there are two extreme points. Either we focus on forms, okay, I am, you are, he, she, it, is, right? Forms or declensions, conjugations in our native language. Or we focus on meaning. And somewhere between these two extremes, we have focus on form that refers to grammar. So in focus on form, we somehow combine the elements of focus on forms and focus on meaning. In this approach, we draw our students' attention to linguistic elements, but, and I highlight this point, elements in the context, as they arise incidentally in lessons whose overriding focus is on meaning or communication. And the purpose of this focus on form approach is to induce the process that is called noticing. That's a very important term. You will find it at your final multiple choice test. The term noticing was introduced for the first time by Schmidt. What is noticing? The process of noticing refers to registering forms in the input so as to store them in memory. Students do not have to understand their meaning or function. To give you an example, if the teacher provides the students with the input, so I say something as a teacher, and I use a new form, a new grammar form, the students somehow try to work out on their own the meaning of a new grammar component. I'm not explaining to my students. I'm using present perfect tense to explain that, there was the past, that something happened in the past and has an impact on what is in the present. But I'm providing my students with some examples and they try to work out on their own what this tense means in the particular context. So we may say that focus and form approach is learner-centered in a sense that it respects learners' internal syllabus. What does it mean? It means that if you are ready for understanding present perfect tense, you will somehow place the new knowledge within your cognitive structures. If you are not cognitively ready to do it, it will take more time for you to place present perfect tense somewhere in the existing knowledge. I guess that at this stage of our discussions about different approaches to grammar teaching, you are quite confused. So, to make you feel even more confused, have a look at the heading, Focus on Form versus Form Focus Instruction. That's quite important because you will find this distinction at your final multiple choice test. So, do not confuse the terms. Focus on form instruction refers to any technique, either proactive, reactive, explicit or implicit, to draw students' attention to language form, any language form. So I would say that form-focused instruction is a kind of an umbrella, right? And under this umbrella, we have focus on form procedures, but at the same time, you may find some activities that are also used for focus on forms. So these traditional techniques or activities that are used in grammar translation method, audiolingual method. So, when is it? It's when teachers and not learners decide what form to be learned is appropriate for them. On the other hand, we have focus on form. Okay? And once again, don't think that in focus on form there are no activities that are used for focus on forms. You may also find some activities that are shared in these two approaches. But these are these activities that arise during embedded, meaning-based lessons. and that are not scheduled in advance. Now let's focus on the distinction, implicit and explicit grammar instruction. I guess that you remember it from your methodology classes. Implicit grammar instruction refers to the situation in which learners have to figure out the rule from the given examples. And definitely it refers to unconscious knowledge of grammatical rules. To give an example, if we as teachers want to introduce present perfect tense, we do not explain to our learners in what situation we use it. We don't give any rules, but we may give an example. For instance, you say as a teacher, well, look what happened to my arm. I've been skiing and look what happened. I have broken my arm, okay? And you point to your arm. Oh, it's really painful. So in this way, you point to the use of a tense in a particular situation. So we may compare this way of explaining grammar rule to the way in which a child acquires its first language. And the opposite instruction is called explicit. So learners are provided with the rule to be practiced prospectively. So we say the present perfect tense is used to express this or that, right? Definitely, explicit grammar instruction is identified with conscious knowledge of grammatical. So you may ask me the question, which instruction is better, implicit or explicit grammar instruction? For whom and when? Well, to answer this question, whether implicit or explicit grammar instruction is better, I will refer to Alice 1994, who claims that when material is simple, it is beneficial to apply implicit instruction. To give an example, gradation of adjectives. It's quite simple, and you may explain it using very simple language to any learners. But we use explicit instruction for a new difficult material. To give an example, explaining conditionals or explaining passive voice requires more advanced vocabulary. That's why we may use explicit grammar instruction, and we may also resort to the native language of our learners. And also another conclusion that comes from Alice 1994 is that generally it depends on the characteristics of the individual learner. And definitely I would agree that it all depends on our learners. There are some learners who require, well, the second language to be used all the time, and there are some learners who actually cannot do without implicit grammar instruction. And now let's focus on a distinction between deductive and inductive grammar teaching. This distinction is these two terms are frequently mistaken by the students. As to deductive grammar teaching, it starts from presentation of grammatical rule, and then it's followed by examples in which a given rule is used. So you start from explaining when do we use present perfect tense, and then you provide your students with some examples, right? You cover some exercises from the book. And the opposite grammar teaching is called inductive, when you start from some examples from the book, and on this basis, the rule is somehow worked out or derived by the learners. If you have any problems with the distinction, think about Sherlock Holmes. He always started from some kind of hypothesis. I know that Miss Hymes was killed by her servant. All right, it was a kind of a rule, okay, his hypothesis. And then, deductively, he was trying to find out some evidence to support his hypothesis. So he said, now I need to support it with some evidence. So each time you think about Sherlock Holmes, think about deductive grammar. And now the question for you to think it over is, which approach relates to explicit and which to implicit rule presentation? Well, yes, you are right. Deductive grammar teaching refers to explicit rule teaching, and inductive grammar teaching refers to implicit role teaching. Now the question is whether we should teach deductively or not to teach grammar in this way. Let's focus on some good points of this approach. First, it goes directly to the point. If we have some present perfect tense or whatever, some grammatical point to explain, definitely it is time saving if we just focus on the definition, and then we have more time for practicing the tense and application of these grammar rules in practice. And another argument is that there are some rules that are simple, and clear explanation of them can be provided more rapidly than in case of eliciting them from examples. So can you imagine a situation that you have the group of pre-intermediate learners and you spend 10 or 20 minutes with your learners to work out the rule when you use present perfect tense? It's just impossible, especially in the Polish school reality. Some learners prefer analytical style. That's a very good point. We as foreign language learners, we should recognize that some students like they have analytical style and they like deductive grammar teaching. And even if we are not proponents of deductive grammar teaching, we as teachers, we should not impose our style, our teaching or learning style on our learners. Then it's unnecessary to anticipate language points, as it is possible to deal with them when they appear. It also somehow recognizes intelligence and maturity of our learners. Well, definitely, deductive grammar teaching requires from our learners some level of cognitive maturity. If you think about child learners and adult learners, definitely we cannot teach deductively grammar to child learners because they are not cognitively ready to understand the very complex grammar structures. And now let's focus on disadvantages of deductive grammar teaching approach. The first one is that if we begin the lesson with a grammar presentation, it might be quite discouraging for our students. If there is some grammar point, whether it's easy or difficult, and we start explaining it using very sophisticated grammar jargon, right, that is not understood by our learners, but we not grasp the main meaning of the use of present perfect tense or whatever. Even if you do it in the native language of your students and you explain to your learners, dzisiaj będę mówiła o zmodyfikowanej grupie werbalnej w aspekcie perfect, but we not understand it. Why? Because they lack sufficient meta language. And another bad point of the deductive grammar teaching approach is direct explanation is rarely memorable. If you think about any definitions that were given to you in your life, most of them you don't remember. We remember examples, but not definitions. And another disadvantage is that it induces a teacher-fronted transmission-style classroom, which may hamper learners' engagement. When the teacher gives us some definition, we are not either emotionally or cognitively very involved. We may say that the learning process is not as active as it is in inductive grammar teaching approach. And finally, the last disadvantage is that it may evoke an impression that learning a language is simply a case of knowing the rules. And we know that it's not true. In order to be understood and to communicate with native speakers or non-native speakers of the target language, we need to know the rules, grammar rules, but we also should know how to use them in appropriate. And now let's focus on inductive grammar teaching approach. The question is to teach or not to teach inductively. Well, let's focus on the first good point of this approach. Discovering the rules by learners may fit their already existing mental structures, and simultaneously these rules become more memorable and meaningful. And there is learners' larger cognitive depth which has an impact on memorizing process. In other words, when we don't explain any rules to our students, but we leave our students alone, and they need to work out the rules on their own, they are more involved in this process. And definitely, if you are more involved in your learning process, what you learn will stay for longer in your mind. Learners are also more active during the learning process. They are more attentive and more motivated. We just feel, happy when we discover, okay, I know. So present perfect in use in this or that context. It also encourages pattern recognition and problem-solving abilities. And finally, it enhances reliance and autonomy among learners. So, to make the long story short, inductive grammar teaching approach is for students who know how to be autonomous, how to be independent, and it requires some abilities, problem-solving abilities, and some level of cognitive development. Unfortunately, there are also some disadvantages of inductive approach. One of them is that a rule discovering is time-consuming. If you think about a class, an English class that it's a 45-minute class, you don't have much time to allow your students to think about working out the rules for 10 or 15 minutes. It may lead learners to believe that rules are goals of language learning rather than means. And another bad point is that learners may not be able to work out a rule, or they may just figure out the wrong rule, or the rule may be too broad or too narrow in its application. So if you think about this typical present perfect tense, there are different aspects of using present perfect tense. And the learners, they may be happy that they discovered this particular use of present perfect tense, but they may be actually wrong. It can be difficult for a teacher to plan such a lesson. And I think that it's the first argument for the teachers not planning, not designing the class in line with inductive grammar teaching approach. It's too time-consuming, and it's too difficult for teachers to prepare different resources, different materials. That's why I think it's more convenient for teachers to, give explicit grammar rules and then practice these rules by means of some exercises. And finally, it can be frustrating for some learners, in particular for those who have their own personal style, or because of their previous experience, they prefer to be simply taught a rule. So once again, learners may be divided into two groups. There are these who are actually proponents of inductive and these who are opponents of inductive grammar teaching. And every time we decide to choose one of these approach, it may be, a painful experience for the rest of a group who prefer, different style of As you may see, there are some good and bad points of these two approaches of inductive grammar teaching and deductive grammar teaching. A kind of alternative to these two approaches is consciousness raising approach, and that is based on providing our students with different activities, grammar activities, in which we want to enhance their understanding of specific grammar features which simultaneously build up their declarative rather than procedural knowledge. If you have problems with understanding declarative procedural knowledge, have a look at explanation. Declarative knowledge refers to what we know. It refers to formulating a rule and then using it. So I know that in the English language there are 16 tenses. There are 3 main conditionals and 2 mixed conditionals. This is what I know. But now, completely different types of knowledge is called procedural. It refers to what I know, how I can implement it into practice. So it refers to using a role of grammar in communication. If you still have problems with understanding this distinction between declarative and procedural knowledge, I will give you an everyday example. If you think about riding a bike or riding a bike or driving a car, if you don't have a driving license, but I guess that you have some declarative knowledge about how to drive a car. You know that you should what? You should put your hands on the steering wheel, right? You know where the brake is. You know that there is what you should do with the keys and so on, right? This is your declarative knowledge. But if you don't have a driving license and I ask you, how do you do it? How do you drive the car? Or how do you ride a bike? But you never try it in your life, you wouldn't be able to answer how to do it. So this is the main difference between declarative and procedural knowledge. Let's have a look at some formal definition of consciousness-raising activities. According to Richards, 1987, it's a way of raising learners' awareness of grammatical features of the language. And this is taught indirectly to facilitate second language acquisition. In this approach is contrasted with traditional approaches to teaching of grammar, in which the goal is to instill correct grammatical patterns and habits directly. Later on, I will give you some examples to show what consciousness-raising activities are about. Consciousness-raising activities are aimed at encouraging learners to think about samples of language and have their own conclusions about how language works. And what is very important is that in this approach, learners are not expected to produce the target structures. But the main idea is that the learners, when they are reading a text or listening to some passage, they just work out the grammar rule on their own, and they understand it by formulating some kind of cognitive representation of how it works. In other words, let's imagine that you are reading out the text at pre-intermediate level and you notice that in front of a noun, sometimes there is indefinite and sometimes there is definite article. You don't have to be able to produce good target structures. But if after introducing these activities, if your consciousness is raised, you will be able to understand that in some particular context, that appears, while in others, it is that appears. Thus, consciousness-raising approach is based on explicit knowledge and not implicit knowledge. That's a very good point for you to remember, because that will be your final multiple choice test. Consciousness raising is directed at specific structures and can result in subsequent noticing of these structures in input. And this noticing may help retention of the structures. In other words, if you have the text and you notice at some stage of your linguistic development, you notice that there are articles. You don't have to be even aware that the or a is called articles, indefinite or definite articles. But what happens? If you work out the rule of your own, then you start noticing in the teacher's input that the same elements, grammar elements, appear. So the main idea of consciousness-raising activities is to be able to notice some grammar elements in other input. Not just in this one in the text that you are provided with, but also in some. So now the question is, what grammar should learners notice in consciousness-raising activities? Well, there are basically 2-3 main grammars that they should notice. First, it's called the grammar of structure. The grammar of structure, the very name suggests that it's related to the order of constituents in a sentence. We know that in the English sentence there is some specific order. That is subject, verb, and object. All right? So, if you are exposed to the sentence, I enjoyed the party very much, you know that you cannot produce a sentence, I enjoyed very much the party, right? So if you notice that very much is in the English structure, right? It appears at the final position, you start producing the correct sentences. To give you a different example, that big black cat over there. We know that in English you cannot say black big cat, that over there, right? And another grammar that the learner should notice is called the grammar of orientation. This type of grammar is related to context, different information that is related to context. So the student notices that the sentence refers either to the past or the present or the future, and the student understands who the message is about. To give an example, my wife works in the garden most weekends. Right? The student should understand that it refers to the wife of a speaker. It refers to their garden. And then we have the grammar of class that's related to verbs, nouns, adjectives, adverbs. There was this theory that women always pass first time. Now, another question that is related to consciousness raising activities is what other aspects we should highlight as foreign language teachers. I guess that the most important are these words that are frequent, right? So we should draw our students' attention to the most frequent words. Then we should draw their attention to text structure. We should introduce exercises that related to cohesion of a text and coherence of the text. Genre analysis that helps us to identify microstructures in the text. We should also draw our students' attention to metaphors, such as time is money. You can spend money, you can save money, or you can go back to the point, come to the end, take another approach, right? This is the real language that we use, that native speakers use, right? And in this way, they give the learners the power to generate a set of new meanings using familiar words. And another aspect of language that should be highlighted, these are skills. Learners should practice in the classroom what they use in a real life situation outside the classroom. So we should practice scanning the text, looking for keywords. We may write CV with our students. We should use knowledge of word associations and also lexical sets. And now let's focus on the main features of grammatical consciousness raising activities. Well, the first one is that grammar presentation starts from a text in a context. So most of the time the teacher distributes a text. And then there are some activities related to the text. For instance, find all the nouns, underline all the nouns in the text. And then you analyze all the nouns and you notice that in front of a noun there is either definite or indefinite article. Then grammar consciousness raising is a kind of a step forward in communicative approach. So definitely it's teaching grammar, but by means of communication. So it's within communication approach framework. And a particular linguistic feature is for focus attention is separated. Information about the chosen feature should derive from both spoken and written text. I think that's obvious that we shouldn't just rely on written text. And the text that showed the particular feature should be also used for communicative purposes. In all activities that are based on consciousness raising, the learners make some intellectual effort. While analyzing the text, you make some hypotheses and then you test them. And the teacher is a kind of a provider of a good solution, right? So first you put forward some hypothesis and the teacher says whether you are right or wrong. And finally, the activities make learners notice a particular features of the. And the last slide for today. Let's focus on types of exercises for consciousness raising grammar teaching. The most common one is called identification. It requires from your students identification of particular structures, grammar structures. For instance, you may say to your students, read out the text carefully and underline or highlight all examples of passive voice or present perfect tense or whatever. Another exercise is called classification. It refers to classification of some identified structures according to some criteria. Or hypothesis making. That's also related to formulating rules about some grammar component. Cross-language exploration, in which you test how a given structure works in your native language. And it's in a form of contrastive analysis, right? You compare present perfect tense and a similar tense in your native language, or articles, whether you find some equivalence of articles in your native language. Then we've got reconstruction. Reconstruction is also quite popular. To give you an example, you transfer the text from active voice into passive. And finally, working with dictionaries or other books to get some extra information about the use of grammar. Okay guys, thank you very much for your patience and for your